Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to another episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host. And Andy, before we get into today's show, I believe you have a little news to share with our listeners and viewers.
Yeah, so I officially left Microsoft, and by the time you hear this, I will have started working for Zscaler. So doing the same thing that I did for Microsoft, really security sales. So still in the security business, still in the security sales business, just working for Zscaler.
And as you mentioned in the pre-show, you'll get a very different perspective as their technical stack is quite different from the Microsoft stack, using a lot of different solutions. So that should help broaden the perspective of the show. And if you've maybe felt like it's been too Microsoft-centric in the past, this could be a positive development. And Andy, I know as part of your recruitment process, you made sure that you had permission to continue with the podcast, which I'm very pleased to report as well. So, our disclaimer may sound a little bit different in the future, and hopefully this will help broaden our perspective and widen our aperture. But for the most part, the show's going to continue as you know, and hopefully love it. So the news here is kind of not a huge deal to listeners and viewers. Hopefully that's the goal at least. So congratulations on the new gig. And obviously you will be dearly missed on the Microsoft side, but look forward to hearing about all your new adventures along the way. And as long as we're talking about it, our, quote unquote standard disclaimer will look a little bit different. We're going to talk some Microsoft stuff in tonight's show. So I've been trying to think, how am I going to update the disclaimer? So, Andy and I both work in security sales at two different industry-leading organizations, Microsoft and Zscaler. But we do the show outside of work and we self-fund the show, and none of that has changed. So the opinions and attitudes you're about to hear shared by Andy and I do not represent those of our employers, Microsoft Corporation and Zscaler, respectively. They're just the opinions of Adam and Andy. And with that, let's get on to it.
All right. So we talked about Claude Fable a few weeks ago and how there was this huge incident with the government and Fable was taken offline. That Fable is basically Mythos wrapped up in like a commercial type wrapper with some guardrails. And so that had launched back on June 9th after Anthropic, who was the parent company, had said, okay, Mythos is too dangerous to ever release to the public, but then they released a Fable. And then they pulled it because the Commerce Department basically slapped it with some export controls. Those controls did get lifted on June 30th, and Anthropic restored access on July 1st. So when it returned back, people obviously were very excited to start using it again. But they quickly found out that it was not really the same Fable that had launched back on June 9th. So Fable ships with every paid plan, so not just usage-based customers, which is interesting because I am a paid customer with Claude. Like I pay for it on my own, and I used to have like a daily usage or like an hourly. It's like a 5-hour block, and then there's a weekly usage cap. But now I have a Fable cap, which was super interesting. And so it ships for everybody, but you can only use Fable for up to half of your weekly usage limit. And then that cap is going to get tightened down even more on July 7th in a couple of days, where it does move to a pay-per-use credit system entirely. So here's kind of the part that I wanted to dig into, because a lot of people, as they were using it, they felt like it felt a little bit weaker. So specifically, as people have been using it, they're saying that it keeps kicking tasks over to Opus 4.8 mid-session. We did talk about this in our original segment on Fable, where there's these guardrails, and if it felt like it was triggering one of these guardrails, like hacking or something that Fable or Anthropic had deemed kind of dangerous, it would then kick over to Opus, which is their lower tier LLM. So users are reporting that it feels weaker and that it's being routed through the stricter safety systems more often than it was before. They're just saying that it's triggering too often and falling back to Opus. I saw like some guy post that said that he went through like $500 worth of like credits and then saw that 75% of the time it was kicking over to Opus and only 25% of the time it was on Fable. Claude Code users are seeing the same thing. One user said that Fable wouldn't let them search for dead code without switching over to Opus. It's pretty obvious when that happens because Claude will tell you that it's switching models. Security and systems systems work seems to trip the guardrails more disproportionately, which I think is important for our listeners. One developer said that the model was basically unusable for certain system level coding like C, C++, Rust, Win32 API work. Anything that touches memories or files with the words like security, vulnerable, unsafe, or hook seem to fall back or outright block that action right away. And this wasn't confirmed by Anthropic in any way. This is more anecdotal and media reporting, but it is very likely that Anthropic heavily tuned those safety guardrails when it took them down because of that pushback from the government. So they're probably just trying to be a little bit more cautious in that. There's been no official response from Anthropic yet. So basically, if you're doing security work and you're trying to use Fable, don't be surprised that it would route to Opus without, for anything that you're trying to do, like if it's touching memory or exploits, low level code. So just be aware of that because it is moving to that pay per use on July 7th. And even then you might get routed back to Opus.
This has been such an interesting story to follow. And as I've pointed out on this show repeatedly, Anthropic certainly employs certain techniques to keep their name in the news and keep people talking about them. It's pretty clear Fable has really strict guardrails initially, and they kind of reduce some of the enthusiasm for it. Now, it is interesting because Opus is still an incredible model and very, very capable. In fact, Opus 4.8 is probably still the leader of the horse race at the moment for non-Fable class models, right? And Fable is kind of that next generation. We're still in the very early days of it. And it does seem as AI models age that guardrails tend to get loosened with time. Initially, when something new comes out, they go really strict, and then they're able to kind of make the rails more clear, like when you're touching the rail versus not. I mean, initially, the models tend to be very cautious and conservative with rejecting prompts, and I see that loosen up over time. So, all of this, Anthropic certainly seems to subscribe to the theory that all press is good press in a way. It keeps people talking about Anthropic. And if you look at our show recently, certainly we have talked way more about Anthropic than we have about OpenAI. And OpenAI certainly enjoyed a brand recognition lead and certainly was seen for several years as the undisputed leader, and everyone else was playing second fiddle outside of bursts of enthusiasm for Gemini this or Claude that. And so this is really valuable to them. And I will say, as Anthropic was kind of first to embrace the enterprise, my experience in my day job has been my number one kind of competitor I'm dealing with. And this is where, Microsoft's business is funny, has been Anthropic. And I get to point out that actually we integrate a lot of their models into Microsoft solutions as well, but they have the mind share at the moment. And so all of this just keeps people talking about them, and I think is overall really, really positive for them. So, great commentary, Andy, and kind of laying out the current state of the situation. And there's been the back and forth with the government and everything else. I guess if I'm to give a take, and I don't even think this is a hot take, certainly it sounds relatively restrictive today compared to where people want to use it. I do expect those to loosen up over time. However, this is where there's just going to be ongoing challenges with models that obviously can be used for good and evil. And I think we'll need to see more programs from the Anthropics, OpenAIs, Googles, Microsofts of the world offering security researchers like a special mode or something where you can prove like, hey, I'm a proven security researcher. Here's some of the research I've done. I'd like to use this for defensive purposes. And they can kind of unlock a less guardrailed version. And I know that's basically what Mythos was, but Mythos seems to have such restrictive distribution maybe a way to gain access to a less lockdown version. Even we've seen things like Apple has done this over time, where you can actually get like a special hard iPhone shipped to you from Apple if you're a security researcher that has a lot of things unlocked in it, like the bootloader and a lot of low level frameworks, so that you can do that security researcher when you're a proven, trusted practitioner. And so I think we'll need to see programs like that stood up at these companies over time, and they've started to dip their toe in the water. We've seen GPT 5.5 Cyber, we've seen the Mythos Project Glasswing program as well. So I think we'll see more of a trend in that direction because I'm not sure of another way. And there's, to be fair, way smarter people than me thinking about this on how do you unlock tools that can be used for malicious purposes for good. And I think you have to do kind of a trusted user program where you've proven that you're using these for good purposes to get in there. And then that raises the whole other question, which I'm also not smart enough to solve, on how do you prevent that from becoming gated to where there's no good path for someone new to break into security research because only the proven security researchers get access to bleeding edge models. And if you're not proven yet, you're working with your hand tied behind your back. That's problematic too. And these are all things that need to be solved as time goes on.
Good take, Adam. All right. So let's talk about the next thing that I wanted to have on the show, which is there is a remote code execution that was a SharePoint vulnerability that landed on CISA's radar. And there's going to be a little follow up on this on CISA, but I wanted to kind of tee it off here first with the SharePoint vulnerability. The reason why it landed on CISA's radar is because they moved this to their KEV catalog, or known exploited vulnerability catalog. So the CVE is CVE 2026 45659. It's deserialization vulnerability, which is just a fancy way of saying that the software trusts data that it shouldn't. So it lets an attacker sneak in code disguised as data, and the result is a remote code execution. This is for SharePoint on-prem. So if you're using SharePoint online, no worries here. This is only for those who are hosting their own SharePoint servers. Microsoft did push fixes for this to SharePoint Server 2016, SharePoint Server 2019, and the SharePoint Server Subscription Edition. It was accidentally left out of the May security update, so it was patched separately. So pay attention to that if you host SharePoint servers and you are following the Tuesday update, patch Tuesday updates. This was an out of cycle patch. So make sure that you take a look at that and patch it. The main thing that is a little bit scary is that you don't need admin rights to pull this off. You just need to be authenticated to the SharePoint. So any authenticated attacker with nothing more than site member permissions, so basically a regular user account, can execute code remotely on the server. No elevated access is needed. So and then the other thing is that it is remote exploitable. So it's network based, so it can be triggered over the internet. And CISA classifies the attack complexity as low. And that means that the attacker doesn't really need to have a deep knowledge of the target system to pull it off repeatedly. So Shadow Server, which is a company, I think, also Microsoft, is tracking more than 10,000 SharePoint servers that are reachable from the public internet right now. Out of those, we don't really know how many have been patched, but that's still a fairly large attack surface. And so this is the second major on-premise SharePoint scares in 2016 or 2026. So make sure that you are staying up. If you're hosting your own SharePoint servers and then you expose them to the internet, one, that's a pretty big red flag. And two, make sure that you are hyper vigilant about tracking the updates to this. The thing that I wanted to connect to is the known exploitable vulnerability catalog, which we have talked about on the show, but I'm going to do a little extra segment on it. So do you have anything that you wanted to add in the SharePoint section, Adam, before I dive into the CISA KEV catalog?
Yeah, not a lot to add here. For the most part, I don't run into a lot of customers still running SharePoint Server. This, of course, does not apply to SharePoint Online. And I think most SharePoint Server use cases have been, there's no longer like a compelling need. Sort of regulatory requirements are really the only ones I still see out there. So probably not applicable to a broad swath of our listeners and viewers. But if it is applicable to you, obviously something you should jump on.
Okay, so the KEV catalog is interesting because, we talked about it where CISA wasn't going to start, they weren't going to assign a CVE for every single vulnerability, only the ones that were added to the KEV catalog itself, which is, I think now, after I've looked at it, and I'll put a link in the show notes to the KEV catalog because it's actually pretty interesting when you go to it. It's a pretty underrated tool, and it's something that I think a lot of security practitioners should be following. Basically, it's a list of vulnerabilities that are confirmed to be actively exploited in the real world right now. So not vulnerabilities that could theoretically be dangerous, like, a 9.5 severity tells you that like the bug is really scary, but the KEV catalog tells you that people are actually using it to break into systems. So I do think that that is a key differentiator. The list has grown significantly. In December of last year, it had 1,484 vulnerabilities on it, with 245 of those added alone in 2025, which was a 20% jump from the year before. For context on how this thing has grown, it was launched back in November of 2021 with just 311 entries. And then the next year, it added 555 and then kind of settled into adding about roughly under 200 a year for a couple of years. And now that's climbing again. I checked it today right before the show, and it has 1,631, which is another 10% increase since December of this year. So just in the last, 6 months, it's jumped 10%. So it's on track to basically get that 20% this year if it continues along that same trajectory. So why is this important to you? So number one, you can subscribe to like the KEV catalog, right? So if you go to the site that's going to be in the show notes, or you just look up, the CISA KEV catalog, there is at the bottom of the site a subscribe now, which is just an email alert through their Gov delivery system. If you are kind of technical and you use RSS feeds, unfortunately, CISA killed off their RSS feed last year in May. So if you built any automation off that old feed, it's dead. Email and structured data exports are now the only path forward if you want the KEV catalog list. So one, you can go and subscribe to email alerts. Two, if you're building like any type of tooling that you need to import this stuff into, you can get the KEV catalog as a CSV file, a JSON file. There's also a documented JSON schema if you want to build something automated around it. So you can pull this straight into a vulnerability management pipeline, a SIM, a ticketing system, instead of having someone, manually check the web page each morning. And if you find something that is being actively exploited that isn't on the list, CISA takes public nominations for that as well. So I kind of wanted to close it out with this thing because as I looked at it, I was like, this is pretty cool. It's something that I think if I was a practitioner, I would definitely be using. And like the SharePoint vulnerabilities, kind of a perfect real world example of the catalog doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Like CISA added it, set it as a hard remediation deadline for all their federal agencies to have a deadline to remediate. And then it gave, security teams a clear signal that this is one that is important. So if you're prioritizing patches off of CVSS scores, you're really kind of missing a key component of that, toolkit, which is this is the one that actually tells you what is actively being exploited today. So I would go and subscribe to it. If you want to build a tool off it, you can get it as a CSV, JSON file, whatever. Anyways, I thought that was a good thing to kind of end our show on today.
Yeah, I love sharing this because a lot of the discourse around CISA has been budget cuts, this has gone away, that has gone away, very negative. And again, fairly and deservedly so. However, there are still a lot of people there who could make a lot more money in private sector who are dedicated to public service. And this is a true public service. This is the sort of thing that the US government should pride itself on. It should be very proud of offering to the broader community. And to your point, Andy, I think the way a lot of organizations have done decision making on what to patch and when is, I don't want to say flawed, but hasn't kept up with the current threat environment. And that's where we should emphasize, of course, actively exploited always over theoretical. and consider other factors as well. And that's another show for another time, like getting into modern, how do you build your plan and what do you remediate first and in what prioritization should you set. I think there's more factors involved than just CVSS today. Obviously, how things can be chained together, the prevalence in your environment, if it's public facing, so on and so forth. And I'm sure a lot of organizations are already doing stuff like that. But this is such a simple and very simple and easily explainable concept to, even if you're talking to a non-security decision maker, this is, the bad guys are using this right now. There is real risk of this, not theoretical risk. And I know sometimes we get a reputation as security researchers of we're always thinking of the worst thing that could happen. And there's a perception of people not in cyber that we're in la la land. We're always worried about, oh, but this could happen. This bad thing is possible. And when you show up and you say, but this is happening right now, it does get people's attention. And so a great call out there on a great resource to leverage and use in your decision making as you patch and remediate moving forward.
All right. Well, that's our show for this week. Thanks for watching and listening as always. Our contact information will be in the show notes if you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.